My name is Stefan Fusenich, and in today's webinar we're going to talk about inclusive assessment and what that means in practice to make sure that your students' assessments are both fair and robust, and talk about the ways that we can support students who might need some additional support throughout the assessment process. So within today's session we're going to focus on a few key areas. So let's have a little look about the things that we're going to talk about. So during this inclusive assessment discussion, we're going to talk about the different types of assessment methods that you use. We're going to talk about the command verbs and the different ways that you can assess them. I'm trying to think about different ways that we could assess some of the things that we've been assessing previously. We'll also identify ways that you could amend your assessments to meet your students' needs and talk about what are reasonable adjustments. So throughout the session, we'll talk about these key things, and hopefully by the end of it, you'll have got some good practical strategies and ideas about what you can do with your learners to make sure that inclusive assessment is taking place. So let's talk about inclusive assessment then. Why is it important? Well, through the inclusive design, wherever possible, and through individual reasonable adjustments where they are required, assessment can provide every student with an opportunity to demonstrate their achievement. And what we mean by this is it allows students to undertake the assessments required for the course with some small tweaks or small changes that mean that possibly not everybody is taking exactly the same assessment in the same way or within the same parameters, but it doesn't lower the value of the assessment or mean that the student hasn't demonstrated the ability to do the task or the skill required. So it's really important when we're talking about inclusive assessment, we're talking about parity, allowing students an opportunity wherever possible through an inclusive design or through some small reasonable adjustments to make sure that the assessment allows them to demonstrate and show what they are able to do and what they're capable of. So it's not about changing assessments to make sure people pass, but it's about making sure that we're giving reasonable chance and reasonable opportunity. And that's when we talk about inclusive assessment, allowing everybody within your group the same chance to pass and the same opportunity to demonstrate the skills that they've developed throughout the time on your program. So that's what we're talking about throughout this. We'll be looking mainly at summative assessment rather than formative assessment, because we know that there's two different assessment types, and we'll be talking about how you make sure that those summative assessments, those assessments that you do for your program, allow students an opportunity to get the qualification that they deserve. So as we talk through this, I'd like you to think about this about summative education, summative assessment rather than formative assessment. But obviously these things can be carried over within the classroom setting, because the way that we will do inclusivity is both in lessons and in assessments. So it will go through, but let's make sure that we are focusing on our final assessments, which demonstrate competency and allow students to get the certification that they so desperately want. So let's make sure that we're talking about it and thinking about it mainly in this way. So what do you need to think about when you're doing an assessment? Well, Suzuki did a piece of research in 2009 about assessing student learning and some of the things that you need to consider. So if you have a look here, they've identified 5 things. They've identified different ways you can assess your students depending on what you are looking to get out of that assessment. So if you're wanting to assess thinking and performance skills, they say to use things like assignments, planned evaluations, or scoring guides and rubrics. So we're talking about some assessments where students might get graded depending on the level of work that they've produced, either through an assessment, piece of work, an assignment, or through practical. So if you're wanting to assess knowledge, they say about using an application task, multiple choice quiz, so you can see if your students actually know and can pick out the right segment. So a good example here could be if you want to get students to do a piece on thinking, you could ask them to write an evaluation of something that they've seen. If you want them to be able to identify knowledge, you could do a multiple choice question that asks them the right way or the right colours for things like wires, the right level of mix for things like building products or for cookery, the steps that you take to build something. So asking students multiple choice questions will assess their knowledge of something. What about if you're wanting to assess their attitudes, values or habits? You could ask students to do something like a reflective piece of writing, or do some surveys and focus groups or interviews, a piece of research maybe. It depends on if you're looking at the students' attitude or whether they've got to assess the attitudes of others. So really important that you look at that. If you're wanting to get an overall picture of student learning, You could consider portfolio, some pictures of evidence of things that they've built up over time. So a great example would be cookery, from the beginning to the end of a product, making cakes or things like that, or looking at electrical circuits, so students building up, or plumbing. You could build a portfolio of pictures, the evidence of skill development over time. If you wanted to compare students against performance elsewhere, how well your students are doing, you could look at some test results or surveys, so you can compare your students' performance to that of others nationally to make sure they're in the right region. A very good piece of practice there in terms of inclusive assessment is to make sure that if you are teaching the course the same as somebody else, it is a standardisation activity to make sure that your marking is as fair as theirs. Would they have given this piece of work a pass, for example, or would they have not? So make sure you do some shared marking as well, because it's a strategy that will allow you to be inclusive, to make sure that you are being fair and robust in the systems that you've got in place. If you're not quite sure about what I mean by that one, you may want to speak to your centre ED, who will talk to you about maybe internal verification and checking some of your work with you to make sure that your work is at the standard of others that would be produced in previous years. If you're new into teaching, it's a good way to look at that. So what about assessment then? So we talked about different types of assessment and thinking about what you would do depending on what you're trying to assess. Well, assessment is really about finding out if learning has taken place. We're wanting to check that the learning that we've delivered or taught to students has actually stuck, they've remembered it, and they're able to apply it in a situation after the teaching's been taken. So what's really important is to think about the process that you're going to decide on in terms of the assessment, which will allow you to check your learner's knowledge against the set criteria. So if the learning has taken place, there should be a change in behaviour, i.e. they should be able to demonstrate the skill, knowledge or attitude and their understanding of it. So think about the criteria that you're being set and think about the way that you want to assess it. So it could be, for example, that students are able to identify health and safety procedures in the kitchen setting. And for that one, you may decide that you're going to do a role play, because you want students to be able to demonstrate their changing behaviours and what behaviours they would do if there was a health and safety issue. So you can ask students to do that type of assessment, possibly a role play or a scenario based one. The other option here could be that you want to check their knowledge, so you could ask them to write a guide for kitchen safety, for example. So that would allow you to check their knowledge. And the other one would be maybe you might want them to demonstrate some safety in the kitchen as a practical aspect. They've walked in the kitchen, ask them to run through the steps about what they would do, how they maintain safety, any things they need to check. So it depends on what you're trying to do. There's multiple ways to do the assessment, but the assessment has to be suitable to what you're trying to get the student to achieve. So thinking about the command verbs would be really important in terms of what the assessment is and what it's asking you to be able to do. So let's have a look at some assessment methods, and then we're going to look on the command verbs slightly later on as we go through. Now, assessment methods are different to assessment types, and it's really important to make sure you're thinking about your method. We talked earlier about assessment types, and we talked about formative and summative. And the formative assessments are things that you would do in class, and we talked in previous webinars about making sure students have learned and have got knowledge, and we talked about giving some input and then doing some recall, or practice activities to give students a chance. That might be the type of activities, using lots of different assessment there to make sure learning's been sticky and students have understood what we want them to. In this part here, we're talking about assessment types, and we're going to be looking mainly at summative assessment, the final assessment that students will be doing, and what type of thing you're going to do. So really it's about what the method will be and how you'll use it. So if you think about summative assessment, what will you do for your summative assessment? You could be thinking about what you'll do for your formative assessment. And formative assessments need to probably replicate the types of things that will be done in a summative assessment. So make sure you give students practice, give them opportunity, make sure they get practice the skills that you're going to be checking on later on. And think about, when we talk about inclusive assessment, making sure that those formative activities are done in the same situation, in the same manner as the summative one will be. To make sure students get a fair practice at it. Because if you're going to allow any reasonable adjustments, which we'll talk about later on, Make sure those reasonable adjustments are in place when you do any sort of formative assessment, which might replicate the summative one, almost like a practice assessment, a mock, if you like, for a better word, which would be the way that you're going to give them an opportunity to practice those skills. So we can set some assessments to be formal or informal. And when we talk about formal assessments, they're probably going to be the summative ones that are done at the end. The informal ones would be things done in class, or things that you can set the students to do at home as practice. Now, formal methods would generally count towards achievement, whereas informal methods would be checking an ongoing progress. So, seeing where your students are at, are they ready to take the assessment? And what's really important there is to make sure, like we said, that the same types of things that you do in the informal process will be replicated when you do the formal. So students are getting the opportunity to practice that skill. There's nothing worse than not having practiced the summative assessment before and it being a shock for students, so they're not being prepared for it and not being able to do their best. So make sure you give them a chance to practice and have a go at that, because that's inclusive and allows them to understand what the actual assessment will look like. There shouldn't be secrets during the assessment process. Okay, so let's have a look at assessment methods. Assessment methods are different to assessment types. And when we talk about assessment methods, it's how we'll use the assessment type and what we'll do with it. Okay, so the method is what we're going to do. So questions for initial assessment, observations for formative assessment, an exam for summative assessment, for example. But what I would say is important is to make sure that your assessment type or method is going to be replicated throughout. So what you intend your students to do for the summative assessment, you give them a chance to do during some formative assessments in class. Now, we would say that assessment methods can be formal or informal, and the formal things that you do count towards the achievement of the qualification, whereas informal methods check ongoing progress of students. So make sure that you give ample opportunity for students to practice, to make sure that they can do the best they can during the summative assessment and that they've had ample opportunity during the formative phase. And when we talk about later on reasonable adjustments, make sure the reasonable adjustments are in place even during the formative assessments that you do in class, because they will give the student confidence when they go into the summative assessment that they're being given a fair shot, that they've had the opportunity to see what the assessment would generally be like, so that they can feel confident when going in there and will have been able to practice it and have an opportunity to demonstrate their skills. Also, for you as a teacher, that will allow you to see when you think the students are going to be ready for taking that summative assessment. And you can intervene and offer support if students aren't quite ready yet, to make sure that they're supported to the best, to make sure that they get the help they need to enable them to do their work and to actually try and get a chance to pass the unit. If, taking the normal assessment method may have been more difficult for them, but you've been given an opportunity there to give some inclusive practice, which you're not, like we said before, we're not making the assessment any easier, we're doing the assessment in possibly a different way, or with some different parameters around it, which allows those students an opportunity to prove they've developed that skill or knowledge that you're looking to assess. So when we look at this in more detail, there are some strengths and limitations with different assessment methods. Depending on what subject you're assessing and the method you're choosing, there will always be positives and negatives of each. These are known as strengths and limitations. So what might be a strength for one subject might be a limitation for another. And that's why when we're talking about assessment methods, we want to try and encourage teachers and trainers to offer multiple different ways to be assessed, to ensure that you're giving your students opportunity to demonstrate their skills and knowledge. So what we're saying is that not every single student may have a different way of being assessed, but maybe offer 2 or 3 ways to demonstrate that competency would be key in vocational education. So when we look at the command verbs in a minute or two, we can talk more about how we might do that and the types of different assessment that you can do. So what we need to move away from is one assessment type meets the needs of all students, and everybody takes the assessment in the same time, in the same way, in the same format. So what it is about being able to demonstrate those skills, and you can do those in different ways. So we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail now as we move through. So let's have a look at these command verbs then and assessment. So if we look through each one of them, some of them are easier to talk about than others in the ways that you can assess. So let's have a look at list, for example. We could say that list is making down a list of components that you need, or a list of ingredients that you need. Now that could be done as a written task, or it could be done as a verbal task. Students are asked to verbally list, could be recorded and included in their portfolio. So students could be given the option between a written list or a verbal list. If we look at something like demonstrate, that means doing. Now sometimes we may need students to demonstrate a particular skill through an observation, and that could be done either with the whole group within a session, or you may find that there's some students who don't feel confident in that, who might want to do it in a smaller group. So there's an opportunity there for the video demonstration to either be recorded on your own, or could be watched back by the assessor, could be done in a small group, or could be done in the class. So think about the opportunity there is about inclusive assessment, discussing with the students the way that they want to demonstrate that, so through that showing of a skill. So if we look at something like state, it's similar to list, point out the main features. So it could be that that's a written document, or students could be looking at a piece of equipment and stating the main features of, for example, an engine, the main components. The other one could be to write down or verbally explain your main points, so summarising something, tell us the main points of, this legislation or this piece of information. So if we look at some of the others, we talk about define, state the meaning of something. So we could ask students to do that verbally or written. So a lot of these chances, there's verbal opportunities are available. If we look at things like identify, describe and explain, these can all be done as a written task, or could be done verbally. So it's really important that students are asked to either write in paragraphs for identify, to write in full sentences for explain, or to write in full sentences for describe. But they could do that with verbal as well, to make sure that they're given examples within there. And the same for outlining, talking about that. When we're talking about applying your knowledge, that could be done written, or it could be done through a practical assessment of a task. So, here's all the pieces of information that you've got. Can you put this piece of kit together? Can you develop this? Can you apply this cookery skill? So it's about being able to do that. So what we want to move towards is students have possibly the opportunity to either do a piece of work written or to do it verbally. And when we talk about written work, you may be offering the opportunity to do it as possibly an IST or an essay. Think about things like a poster. If you're going to do verbal, you could ask students to do a short video, a PowerPoint presentation to go with it. Start thinking about those things, and the command verbs of what you're asking the student to do and demonstrate, they're not necessarily the way that the task will be completed. So the command verbs don't tell us that the describe has to be written. What they tell us is that a describe must be a clear definition, a clear description that tells us the main points. They tell us that an identify is the basic facts. They tell us that an explain is making your point clear by giving enough detail. They tell us that a list is the main features of something, and they tell us evaluating is bringing together information to make a judgment on the importance or success of something. So at the end of a project, for example. So when we look at this, the command verbs don't tell us what we must do in terms of our assessment method, but they tell us about the things that we're assessing. And that's where inclusive assessment becomes important, because you are assessing that somebody can demonstrate, state or list. We're not necessarily assessing their ability to do it in a written format or to do it in a verbal format. So if students do prefer to do things written, there may well be an opportunity. If students prefer to do things verbally, you could do that opportunity as well. There's just a couple of things where we'll need to see some practical demonstration, of course, because this is technical application, and that would be the demonstrations, and that would be the applying of the skill. So where there's the need to demonstrate actual practical skill, that can't be done in a written format, but it could be done in a smaller group setting to support students who may be feeling anxious about doing presentation in front of their peers or demonstration in front of their peers or within a group. So multiple opportunities to use things like technology here to make sure that we're giving students the opportunity to be assessed inclusive. If we don't have time to do it on a one-to-one within the workshop, could they book the workshop themselves, do what the assessment was, record themselves doing it, which could be watched back by a tutor. So think about the ways that we can use technology now to enhance our assessments to make sure that we're being more inclusive. So what's inclusive practice as in assessment? Well, inclusive practices really, in order to provide students with equal opportunity to demonstrate their learning, you need to, as assessors, think about the different means of demonstrating a particular learning outcome. When we talk about the outcome, the key part of the outcome is the command verb. The command verb, the demonstrate, the identify, the do, what the word is, the doing word, what you've got to do to actually complete the task. Now, ensuring that students have a variety of assessment choice or some individual choice, like we said, in the way that they will do it, can lead to an enhancement of the assessment process and benefit the students. So having a couple of options there for assessment to actually demonstrate that command verb are really important. So look back on your assignments. How many options are there for students? Do all students have to do exactly the same task? And if that's the case, you're not being inclusive because you're not allowing some level of choice or some variety in the assessments that meets the needs of everybody in your group. So try and be a bit more varied, try and encourage student choice within the assessment process. If students are continually choosing the same thing, then obviously it's down to the tutor to have that challenging discussion with them about what they could do to improve their skills and what types of assessment you'd like to see them attempt moving forward. So what can be the common problems in assessment practices currently that we see? Well, often course teams fail to consider inclusivity in their design stage and find themselves using a range of one-off assessments or making one-off adjustments throughout the course to meet the needs of a particular student. So often such modifications come at a cost and actually run the risk of an element of bias in the process. That this student's got a totally different assessment to everybody else. Why is that? Why wasn't I offered that opportunity to do the assessment in that way? I think I would have done better. That could be something that comes back from students. By setting up alternative arrangements for students with particular needs, it can create a sense of a two-tier system. So it can make people feel singled out or feel that they've got special needs and that they don't necessarily want those adjustments then. Some students could say, I don't want to do this adjusted way of assessment. I want to do what everybody else has done. And the problem that you've got there then could be that those students might not pass. So because they're not taking the type of assessment that will give them the opportunity to demonstrate their skills. So try to make sure that any single process that you come up with can accommodate students who've got those additional needs. So by not making those adjustments, students can sometimes simply fail, and because we're not allowing them the opportunity to demonstrate their skills. So what reasonable adjustments can you offer them? Well, you can offer extra time. What do we mean by this? Well, traditionally, extra time was offered to students who've got things like dyslexia or difficulties with writing or following instructions. And these students may need more time to read the instructions carefully, to make sure they understand what they're doing, or to gather their thoughts or ideas. So if we talk about students with dyslexia, for example, they would often be offered 20% extra time in an exam, or within a practical or an assignment, to give them the time to actually prepare and plan what they're going to write for a piece of work. So if you want more information on things like dyslexia, you can have a look at some of the SkYE worksheets that talk about supporting students with learning difficulties and give you some teaching tips. Other students might need readers. This is where students possibly got low levels of literacy. So have a think about, are there any students in your group that do require a reader? And if they do, how will you manage the assessment for them? Will you be the person that does the reading for them? Again, some of the students with low levels of literacy may require a note taker, or if they have difficulties with mobility, they might require a note taker. So think about how you'll manage that with a written task. Who will be the note taker? Where will that take place? Or can you enable the student then to take the verbal option of that assessment? Some students might need larger print, so think about when you're giving out any assessments, any exams, any pieces of material. If you've got students, for example, with visual impairments, can they have larger print? Can they be given the print that they need to be able to see what's on there? Also think about the colour. There'll also be some students that may be better off doing assessments on the computer. They may find it very difficult writing, but may have got good computer skills. So can you get access to computers for some of your students to produce portfolios? And we talked earlier about students with anxiety, students possibly with some mental health problems that don't maybe feel confident, or are low in confidence, and are not confident about doing group assessments. Could you do some smaller group assessments? Could you do some one-to-one? Could you allow them to record themselves now with the newfound technology that we've been using, and send that to you to allow you to assess them? It gives them the same opportunity as everybody else to do the actual piece of work, but in a much more comfortable environment to them. So these are some of the traditional extra time things that people can be offered. So think about smaller group assessments for exams as well. Some students might like to be put in a large room with other people. Could they be put in a quieter space with maybe one or two other students to allow them to focus on their exam? So these are the type of reasonable adjustments that we could traditionally offer. And if you've got students with additional needs, like I said, there are some information guides from SkYE about supporting students with additional needs that covers things like dyslexia, dyscalculia, ADHD, and autism. So have a look at those guides, and you'll talk and be able to see some of the reasonable adjustments that we suggest that you could do with those students within the classroom setting, in terms of your teacher practice, but also in terms of assessment practices. So let's have a look at an overview. So an overview of this then is, let's have a look and see about your assessment strategies. Review and reflect on your current assessments. Are they assessments that are set for everybody? And would you have to produce a one-off assessment for students with additional needs? Or are you offering that choice to meet those command verbs? Think carefully about that. Does your assessment speak only to doing written work? Does it speak only to doing practical work? What are the differences between the two? Are there other ways that assessment could be undertaken by students? Next thing is, think of the ways that students can demonstrate command verbs and offer assessment options.